In a world that's constantly telling us to communicate more, talk things out, what if the most powerful thing you could do is just say nothing at all? Today, we're going to dissect a pretty controversial communication framework. It's called the void strategy, and it argues that silence can be your ultimate advantage. And that brings us to the big question right up front. Is saying nothing really your most powerful weapon? I mean, it sounds completely backward, doesn't it? But that is the core idea from this text that we're going to explore. All right, let's get into it. First up, the power of silence. And the key thing to understand here is that the source material doesn't frame this as being passive or weak, not at all. It frames silence as a strategic tool. But okay, before we can even get to the solution, we have to understand the problem it's supposed to solve, right? And the source has a name for this. It calls it the communication trap. Now, to really understand this trap, we have to look at some of the, well, let's just call it specific and controversial language the source uses. A really key term you'll see is the shit test. And as the text defines it, this is basically any kind of challenge or provocative statement that's designed to test a man's confidence, or what it calls his frame. So how does someone supposedly fall into this trap? Well, the source argues it's by doing what most of us would do instinctively. Things like over-explaining yourself, justifying your actions, or that impulse to just communicate more. According to this text, all of these common responses lead to the exact same outcome, a loss of what it calls frame control. Okay, so if the text is claiming that over-communicating is actually the problem, then what's the solution? Well, this is where we get to the core idea itself, the void strategy. And this quote from the source really gets to the heart of the whole philosophy. Most men talk themselves out of attraction. The core belief here is that in these kinds of high-stakes interactions, your words aren't your friends. In fact, they could be your enemy. So what is this strategy exactly? Well, the source defines it as the deliberate use of silence. And the stated goal is, well, it's fascinatingly specific. It's to allow what the text calls her internal existential crisis to reestablish his value in the relationship. Yeah, it's a pretty provocative claim about what's going on inside someone's head. But what's the supposed psychological mechanism at play here? How does this even work? To explain it, the text uses a really vivid metaphor it calls the dark room effect. And here's the core of that analogy straight from the source. It says, compare silence to a dark room. She'll fill it with her own fears and insecurities. The theory behind this is that a lack of data, a void, is psychologically uncomfortable, and the human brain will just rush to fill in that blank with its own story. So the source actually maps this out into a 4-step process. Step 1, you create the data void by stopping all the explaining. Step 2, the text alleges that her mind then tries to fill that vacuum, often with fears and insecurities. Step 3, this internal scramble leads to that so-called existential crisis. And the final step, according to the source, the man's value is reset and attraction is reestablished. So what's the ultimate goal of all this? What's the point? Well, that brings us to our final section, reclaiming frame control. So we've been using this term, but what does the source actually mean by frame control? It's defined as maintaining your own perspective and your own reality within an interaction, rather than getting pulled into and just reacting to the other person's. And that's the final piece of the puzzle. According to the source, the very act of not explaining, of using the void strategy, is the thing that reclaims frame control. So, in this view, silence isn't passive at all. It's an active move to reclaim power in the dynamic. Which brings us right back to the central tension of this whole strategy. When you look at the mechanics laid out by the source, is this kind of strategic silence a sophisticated communication tool, or is it a psychological weapon? That's the question this explainer leaves us with.